Hello, everyone. Welcome to Relevant. I hope you are all doing well. My name is Allison Whitmell. I'm a second-year piano performance and composition student at U of T, and I will be your MC. Our talk today is called No One Should Hurt Alone. Let's talk about mental health. We'll be exploring God and mental health through hearing a student's story, listening to a talk, and having a Q&A. First off, I'm going to cover a couple of ground rules. Please let us know if you have any accessibility needs, such as with your audio or video, and we will try our best to accommodate you. Secondly, do not be afraid to ask challenging or uncomfortable questions, but please try to be respectful when doing so, and please refrain from using inappropriate language. I'd like to begin today with a land acknowledgement. As Christian organizers of this event, we believe peoples and land were created by God. And we want to acknowledge this on the land that University of Toronto and McGill University operate on. For thousands of years, the land University of Toronto is situated on has been the traditional land that God gave to the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River most recently. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. McGill is situated on land that has been the meeting place of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We are truly grateful for the opportunity to work and learn here. Now, if you take a look at the chat, there is a Google form. Feel free to use that to provide feedback on the talk, or you can fill it out if you want to be contacted for a follow-up meeting to discuss the talk further. We are now going to hear a student's story. Megan from McGill will be sharing her experience with mental health.
Hi everybody, my name is Megan and I'm currently a third-year student at McGill, and I'm really excited to be here today to share a little bit about my story and my experiences with mental health. So I grew up in the church, and it really didn't help that there was very minimal discussion, sermons, or education in general about mental health, and it was the same at school as well. So when I entered high school and had my first real experiences with mental health, I was really caught off guard and didn't know what to do. I felt ashamed that I was having these thoughts, these really negative feelings. And looking back on it now, I think it was just the mended pressure of academics, friends, relationships, family, all coming to me at once. So personally, high school was a pretty tough time for me. When I was alone, I had really dark thoughts, but when I was with my friends or family, I was perfectly normal and I seemed happy, cheerful. In fact, I think I tried to act more happy and cheerful when I was around others to conceal the fact that I was really struggling. And the biggest feeling that I felt during this time was shame. I felt as if I was the only 16-year-old girl that was going through these emotions, these struggles, and I felt all alone. I felt ashamed to have these thoughts in the first place, so I really couldn't talk to any of my friends, my parents, my school counselor, or even my pastor. Feeling this shame made me lead to the fear of judgment. I was scared that people would judge me, and I was scared that how I was acting and feeling was not normal. I desperately wanted to speak to someone about it and seek help, something as small as just talking to someone and feeling validated and understood. However, my thoughts kept getting darker, and it really influenced how I acted and behaved around other people. Then the summer before my final year of high school, I knew I needed to talk to someone. And the safest person I can think of in that moment was my pastor. I knew he wouldn't judge me, and he'll probably be able to offer me some advice. That conversation that I had with my pastor completely changed my life, and the lessons that I learned I still carry with me today. One of the greatest sources of comfort that I got as a Christian during this conversation was that I was not alone. I felt validated, I felt understood, and it was such an amazing feeling to know that someone was with me, empathizing with me, and knowing all the feelings that I felt when I was struggling. And when I thought about it, Jesus experienced the same feelings that I experienced, whether it be sadness, anger, or frustration. Jesus on earth was tempted the same way I was. He was sad, and he went through even more difficult situations than me. After this experience, I became more vulnerable and was able to talk to other people about my mental health, but I also became a lot more confident in my mental health and felt less ashamed. Even today, when I go through my own struggles, whether it be big or small, I keep reminding myself that Jesus went through these exact emotions that I'm feeling and that He is with me. So, thank you for listening to my short story about mental health, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the talk.
Thank you so much, Megan, for being open with us and for sharing how Jesus has helped you in your life. I am now going to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Domenic Ruso. Dr. Russo is a church planter from Montreal. After completing graduate studies at Concordia University, Dom felt called to lead and serve in the local church while pursuing a PhD. He is passionate about helping the church be a voice of change and hope. In addition, he believes that when we create space for people to share questions and struggles, God's gracious ways become more visible and transformative. His passion is to see new and emerging leaders who learn to articulate this good news of Jesus in fresh ways. Throughout the talk, if you think of any questions for Dr. Russo, feel free to head to the link in the chat, which is slido.com, and type in the code relevant. From there, you type and send in your questions, and you also have the opportunity to vote on questions that you would like to have answered in the Q&A by just clicking the thumbs up button. Now, without further ado, please welcome Dr. Russo.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you all. This is such a real honor of mine to be able to address a topic that for many of us feels overwhelming and very personal. And I know for some of you, as we think about doing this over Zoom, we feel how COVID and the isolation of this time has made this topic feel a lot more urgent for us. And maybe I just want to begin by mentioning, that I, a few years ago, was exactly where many of you are as students. Like you just heard, I was a graduate student at Concordia, and I know all McGill students are booing. But then went off and did some doctoral studies at University of Toronto. And I was just so interested in God and religion and faith. I'm now a spiritual leader and a pastor. And I remember the first few years of my learning experience in CEGEP, in seminary, which is training to be a pastor. And I remember one experience that really opened my eyes to how I was learning to deal with the emotions in my own life that I almost had no words for. And it happened in my first year of university or kind of training to be a pastor. In one of those first years, there was an assessment that went out to all the students, first year students. It was kind of like a questionnaire, fairly simple questionnaire. And part of that section of that questionnaire kind of threw me off. It asked me about my family, about my upbringing. And I don't even remember the truth about how I answered all those questions, but some things of what I said triggered a note at the time by the guidance counselor at our school. And I thought, this is really weird. I'm not going to see no guidance counselor. I don't have any problems. This may be just a mistake. And so I kind of ignored it for a while. And I thought, maybe at some point I should just go see what they said and what this was really about. And when I went to talk to the guidance counselor, she asked me some questions about my life and growing up and the pressures and the expectations that I think I was carrying that I wasn't even sure how to articulate. And maybe you're watching this, or maybe you know someone that you care about, that you realize that their inner lives turn very complex when there's no room to articulate expectations and fears of failure, or just what it is that they're meant to do in life. And I mean, some of these things are just universal questions. I think we all feel them, no matter what you believe about God or faith. But at some point, some of those questions can turn into something more difficult and challenging, and other emotions creep in. And for me, that experience with the guidance counselor really helped me to see something that had to do with how I processed kind of the darkness that I was facing at the time. And I kind of felt trapped. And so I just want to share my screen and begin by just sharing very simply, just two simple questions. I want you to think of a time in your life, maybe when you felt trapped, when you were wondering about how you had to either make a decision or a difficult conversation you might have to have with someone, where certain emotions crept to the surface, and maybe to think about which feelings best describe how you responded in those moments. In a week from today, Bell is going to launch their yearly campaign called Bell Let's Talk. And all of us will hear about it, we'll share about it, we'll celebrate that, it's one of the many tools that we're thinking of on how to get people to talk about mental health and to kind of dispel the stigma. And I'm so grateful for Megan and for her video for doing that for us, even in her own story. But one of the things that I've realized in my own life is that as I thought about those early years in university, that as I felt trapped in the questions and the fears I was facing, the feelings that came to the surface for me were anger. I was really, really angry, and I was, struggling with what to do with that anger. And in fact, I really believed that, other people wouldn't understand the anger that I was feeling. And I know that's hard to understand, because oftentimes when we think of mental health and when we think of, the emotions that are equated with mental health, anger doesn't always creep up as a top one. Loneliness does, depression does, sadness, the feeling of being in a dark place does. But for me, it was anger. And I think I just want to begin by just encouraging some of you to remember this, that maybe you're feeling different types of emotions. And here's one of the things that I consistently have seen with people who begin to ask for help and who begin to speak and to share of the weight of mental health in their own lives, is they actually don't know how to talk about it. And I think that's important when we think about a time where we're about to just be encouraged to talk. Like the Bell Let's Talk campaign sometimes can miss that real painful moments in our lives, often lead to a time when we're not sure how to talk, when we're not sure how to explain what we're feeling. So the pressure of asking someone to talk about how they're feeling actually can make it worse, can make us feel like we don't have the words, or we're not even sure how to begin to talk about this. And here's where my personal struggles and my personal challenges of growing up in a home filled with expectations and pressures, and the first person really in my family to really go to university and think about being a pastor, being a spiritual leader, all of these concerns about maybe being a failure, not sure what even being a spiritual leader meant. I remember being shocked that there was a book in the Bible that gave people words for when they weren't sure how to talk about their feelings related to a difficult time in their lives. Maybe that's brand new for you. It was totally brand new for me to realize that there was a book right in the middle, almost in the middle of the Bible. It's a book filled with poems and prayers for people in uncertain times. It's a book actually given to us at a time when people were working through uncertainty and doubts and wondering where God was in their suffering. Some of you maybe know this. The book is called the Book of Lamentations. We get the idea of lamenting and crying out on God and trying to figure out, like, I just need words to express some of the things that are going on the inside of my life that I'm really not sure. Maybe some of you find yourself in that season right now. So let me just give you just a simple few verses from that Book of Lamentations and see if maybe it helps you in what you're thinking about today. This is pretty much, here we go. Here's one of these verses from Lamentations. It says this: I called on your name, Lord, from the depths of the pit, and you heard my plea. Do not close your ears to my cry for relief. You came near when I called you, and you said, do not fear. I just think about how important it is for many of us to realize that it's okay not to have the right words to express deep pain, deep sorrow, questions and doubts about suffering in the world. And more importantly, when that suffering moves internally, it moves towards the inner parts of our lives. And I remember I was kind of beginning to realize like a freedom that was available to me and to others when I realized that the Bible, or the spiritual book of ancient prayers, was already hinting at the things that I was feeling. Maybe for you, you think of spirituality, you even think about Christianity, and the furthest thing from your mind is a safe place to talk or to be honest about your feelings. But let me just remind you that, there is some incredible resources that are meant to remind us that others who have come before us have felt like in a pit or in a place of deep despair. And the Bible provides this incredible language to begin to help us explore what it is we're feeling. Just like Megan, one of the things that happened to me was I started to experience this release of shame, this release of like, maybe there's something wrong with me, or maybe I'm being punished. I mean, one of the things that often happens in religious circles that is very, very problematic is that people, when they experience deep seasons of suffering, they start to believe that maybe they're being punished for something. They start to feel like that maybe they did something wrong and they're like almost cursed. And so I'm really excited that even the topic of this short talk is about that no one needs to hurt alone, that other people have experienced certain pains and certain seasons of darkness, and that we can actually help one another when we're feeling that or when we notice someone else feeling that. I want to also tell you something that's really, really unique to our culture that was very different than the world of scripture, the world of the Bible, the world of even other religious traditions, that we live in a world almost addicted to self-help. Almost that we are almost convinced and almost trained to think about our problems are meant to be fixed on our own, that we're meant to fix the things we deal with. Actually, a good leader is someone who solves problems. A good student is someone who gets things done. And all of these things can be good things. But when it comes to mental health, this constant reminder of a self-help culture that says you should be able to fix this yourself, and if you were good enough, you would fix this or find a way out of this, can actually counteract what actually is needed when we start to experience deep seasons of pain and suffering. So maybe today's talk for you is just that feeling of being set free, that you cannot really fix this by yourself, that you will need the words and the prayers of others. You will need a space of safe dialogue and conversation and questions like we're about to do in a little while. And I remember for me, another moment that really kind of helped me understand this is that I needed a new perspective on pain. I needed a new perspective on suffering. And it came in the most unlikely place for me. It actually happened on a time when I went to see the dentist. I don't know, maybe some of you are praying that you become a dentist one day, and I hate the dentist and I never wanted to go see the dentist. But one day I remember feeling this pain in my tooth and I could not avoid visiting the dentist any longer. And I went to see the dentist, and they started to do like typical test of what's going on, in my mouth. And at one point, the dentist poked a part of my tooth, and they said something so profound that to this day I still think about it when I think about the pain that we sometimes feel in our lives and the suffering we see in the world. The dentist said to me, "I'm going to start poking in certain areas in your teeth, and I need you to tell me when you feel pain." And I was like, isn't the point of this for me not to feel pain? And they said, no, actually, when you feel pain, it's actually a good thing. And I realized how like counterintuitive that was for me. And I said, well, what do you mean if I feel pain, that's a good thing? They said, actually, if you feel pain when we poke, it actually means that the nerve in your tooth is still very much alive. And it has receptors to receive the pain. But if you feel no pain, that's like a really bad thing. It actually means that your tooth is completely dead and we have to start a whole other procedure. And I realized for the first time that I was being given a new perspective on why we experience pain, why we experience suffering, and maybe there's a deeper reason for that. I mean, research has been going on this for many, many years. And actually, there's people who are researching a special, unique type of illness for people who actually cannot feel pain. Can you imagine something that sounds so great, to feel no pain, to feel no suffering, to feel no sadness, that when people actually experience that, they realize it's one of the darkest things they feel. Actually, there's research on it, and years ago, I read a story on this, and actually there's a story you can read online. I'm just going to highlight it. It's called The Curse of Not Being Able to Feel Pain. And there's some stories of people, imagine like burning your hand and not knowing that you had burnt your hand, or stepping on a nail and not realizing that you're bleeding because there's just no pain. It's mind-blowing that some people live like this and experience this. And one of the people who has this illness actually talks about the challenge of dealing with this illness. And this is what they say. I'm just gonna go to the slide. It says this is the curse of people who never feel pain. It says people assume that feeling no pain is this incredible thing. For people with congenital insensitivity to pain, CIP, it is the exact opposite. We would love to know what pain means and what it feels like to be in pain. Without it, your life is full of challenges. And I thought maybe this is an insightful thing for us to think about, what it means to wrestle with and to feel just the pressures of, the suffering and pain that we think of when we think of loved ones that we have who experience mental health issues, or when we ourselves are going through a time where we feel depressed and sad. And the natural, maybe human response is to say, hey, I just wish this was all gone. I wish God would fix this, or I wish someone would take this away. And I remember the temptation to self-medicate, to be addicted to certain things. I was addicted to music and all kinds of other things to maybe make me forget about the pain or the sadness or the anger. And then a switch kind of changed in my thinking that maybe you need today. Maybe you need to realize that maybe the pain that you're carrying or some of the questions that you're holding on to maybe are meant to point you to something bigger. Maybe they're meant to develop certain things in you that you never thought you had. One of the things that happened to me is I developed this sense of empathy that I don't think I had before. I started to be able to notice in other people who were very, very angry when they experienced really painful upbringings, because I picked up cues in their speech and in the way they acted that were very common in my own life. That sometimes experiencing pain and suffering and seeing it around us develops certain muscles in us to be able to care and be empathetic and to come alongside other people who are feeling that pain. I kind of want to wrap up our time before we go to some questions time with a story that really kind of highlighted this for me in our culture. And it has to do with the story in the life of a woman called Ellen Baxter. Ellen Baxter was a psych student, and she'd been studying psych, and she became very, very interested in people with mental illness, especially people in the psych ward who were struggling with real serious, clinical challenges. And she decided that she was going to go study and visit a little town in Belgium, this little town in Belgium that was famous for really caring for people who had mental illness and mental health issues. To this day, it's still a very, very famous place. And she tells a story about this experience that I want to tell you, and it's the button story. And the button story really changed my thinking about mental health and how we need to approach this, and how faith conversations, science, our cultural systems need to really come together to revisit this in a new way. She tells a story about this boy whose mental health led him to maybe a bit older than a boy, but led him to every day wear a jacket, and he would rip the buttons off of this jacket. It was kind of like a coping mechanism to deal with some of the pain. And Ellen, as she studied in this town, she realizes that the lady that this boy stayed with a family, and every day the lady who kind of took care of this boy would see it as one of her tasks to take the buttons that were ripped off of this jacket, to take the buttons that were kind of on the floor, and when the evening was over, she would sew the buttons back onto this jacket. And this would happen every day. Can you imagine? Like the moment of kind of putting on a jacket, taking all the buttons off as a way of just kind of working through pain and emotions and feelings and questions. And then one day, Ellen, this researcher who was noticing this, went to the lady who sewed the buttons back onto the jacket, and she said, "Why didn't you just like put different buttons on, or why don't you just put like fish, kind of this dental floss wire or some different type of thread so that the buttons cannot really be ripped off of the jacket?" And the lady said, "Why would I ever do that? This is so important for this man who's living with me to be able to rip the buttons off of his jacket. It's a way that he makes sense of the things that are going on in his life." And that day, Ellen, this researcher, she talks about how what she learned from this small town was that they didn't see people who struggled with mental health or mental issues as people to be fixed, but as people to be cared for and people who we could have compassion with and learn from. I mean, this was like a real aha moment in a culture that often teaches us that problems and sometimes people who have problems have to be fixed. Maybe for you, that's something that kind of helps you rethink what you're feeling, maybe helps you rethink how you view this mental health conversation. It definitely helped me, because I often think of, if only we can fix this, if only I could fix this problem, if only I could get over this. And maybe that's the wrong way to look at a situation. That maybe the real issue is to be present with people and to listen and to be okay with people who do certain things or who are wrestling with certain things in a way that we wouldn't always understand, but to be present with them in those moments. I want to wrap up, and I want to just end with a last verse from this Book of Lamentations. And it's a verse that talks about a very profound idea that helped me, and I think will help you maybe as we wrap up this talk. It says this, that because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I mean, this is an incredible prayer that highlights this gift of compassion, which is this word that means to suffer with someone. The word compassion means to suffer with others. We actually get the English word patient from it. Or if you've ever seen The Passion of the Christ or some movie, the actual word passio means to suffer with others. And maybe we are entering this new dialogue on mental health as a reminder that we need to come along others who are suffering and not try to fix them, not try to figure out exactly how to make things better right away, but to should be present with them in those moments and to learn a new type of empathy, a new type of way of being together in suffering, and to grow from that. So I'll turn it over to Allison.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That was amazing. Thanks for giving us that new perspective on mental health and on pain, and for sharing your story, and for the recommendation of the Book of Lamentations. That was really helpful. Thank you. So we're just about to head into our Q&A session now. And to reiterate, if you have any questions, please head to slido.com. Link is in the chat, and type in the code relevant. From there, you send in your questions, and like I said earlier, you have the opportunity to upvote any questions that you really would love to have answered. And just before we begin our Q&A, I'd like to walk you through the follow-up form, which is also in the chat. We'd love to hear your opinions and give you a chance to connect. So please feel free to open that up now and follow along with me as I go through it. So the first question that comes up is what campus you're from. So this is organized by U of T and McGill, and we'd love to see how many schools are represented in these talks. Which talk did you attend? Look for the talk that happened today, the No One Should Hurt Alone talk, and click that one. Let us know how you heard about this event. It helps us to know what advertising methods are most helpful. Then there's 2 questions about the event itself, so feel free to fill those out as well. After that, the question is, do you identify with a particular spirituality or religion? This helps us see how diverse our audience is. Then what other topics would you be interested in exploring? Let us know. Any general comments or feedback that you would like to give us would be amazing too. And then the last part is asking if you would like to connect at all with someone from one of the Christian groups that organized Relevant. Would you want to connect one-on-one for further discussion, or check out Alpha, which I'll talk about in a little bit. It's a video and discussion series exploring Christianity. That's what Alpha is. And if you do want to connect, please leave us all your contact info. And if not, don't worry about that section. And thank you so much for filling it out. All right, so now heading into our Q&A. And the first question we have is how to help someone who is clearly struggling with mental health but will not admit it. How do you help them?
Yeah, that's a great question, Allison. I think, my experiences at times is to just one, just acknowledge with them that there's things that you maybe notice that you're available to them if they're really willing to talk, or if they just need a place to be, a safe place to kind of dialogue about some stuff. I think all of us know the feeling of trying, to be fixed by someone else, or to be like, I see a problem in your life that I'm going to help you with. That kind of can be standoffish with people, and especially as we're realizing, for some people, even talking about needing help can feel like a shame thing. So I often find that just making yourself available whenever a person becomes open to sharing is step one. Just saying, hey, I'm here. If you ever need to talk, I'm just a phone call away or a text away or whatever. The other thing I would encourage people to do is to share about a time when, you yourself got help, or it was really helpful for you to talk to someone. That often opens up a new window for people to be like, wait a second, you know what it's like to feel trapped, or you know what it's like to feel like no one's there, and you talk to someone. That often helps someone to begin to explore admitting it, or even taking a first step. So I think that's important.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Next question. How do I learn to articulate my deep emotions and my past to people I love? And this person also said, sometimes I can't even find the words, and that's really hard for my loved ones.
Yeah, that's really, really an important question. So thanks for sharing, whoever shared that. I think it's important to hear this. It's okay not to know how to share how you feel. Like it's just okay. And I think there are different people throughout the years as a leader that helps people through some of this. I found that people use some different tools that helps them. For some people, writing about how they feel is maybe the last part of the process. Sometimes it's just exploring different art forms, whether it's poetry or music or different ways before you actually get to the words that pinpoint how you're feeling. There's a lot of resources out there that are being explored now on helping people explore, feelings from different perspectives. And I found too, some of the feelings that I felt early on in my anger, in my moments, like I shared, would change. Anger turned to real sadness, and so be okay with some of those feelings changing along the way. The easiest way is to just find a safe friend or two that you can share it with and ask them if they hear anything consistently about how you're sharing how you're feeling. That's always been helpful for me. Like I'll be like, I'm not sure how I feel about this, so let me tell you a story that happened that maybe brings me back to that place. And as I shared this with a friend, they would often say, hey, I think what you're feeling is regret, or I think what you're feeling is a deep sense of doubt. So someone else hearing the story with us can help us begin to pinpoint those feelings. That can be helpful.
It's really wise. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
For generations, for the generations and people who don't believe in mental health, how can we encourage them to understand? Or should we try to help them understand? And how can we do that?
I think that's a hard one. I think for people who think mental health is either a hoax or mental health is kind of like an excuse, there's a lot that's always going to be there. I think experiencing it yourself or seeing someone you love go through a very difficult time really opens your eyes to how complicated mental health is. And we need specialists at different areas of our society to be helping us with this. Like I said earlier, religious leaders, school educators, scientists doing research. I mean, it's across the board. I would say be very sensitive about trying to really help someone who doesn't see it at all as a concern. It might be more frustrating than anything to get them to see it. It sometimes might backfire because you could be more discouraged than encouraged in those difficult moments. Sometimes I find that with some people, using the word mental health or mental illness is what makes it creates a barrier for them because they see that as a big problem that's scary that they never want to talk about. So if you are trying to get someone to begin to understand how you're feeling or to get serious about this dialogue, maybe don't begin by using the word mental health right away. Use language like, I feel a sense of unrest. There's, I feel like really, discouraged, or I'm regretting something. That tends to be off-putting, that for some people who really are against the conversation, mental health can trigger things of being like, oh, I don't want to talk about this. This is going to it sounds like a lot of work, for some people. Like, this is going to be like, do I have to read a book? I'm not doing that, something like that. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's great. How can people struggling with mental illness see that there is a way out through seeing the big picture instead of committing suicide, to name the worst?
Yeah. Well, one thing for sure is to know that that they are not alone in some of these dark places that they find themselves in. Like that they're not the first ones to have gone through this, and so some of the things that they're feeling, one of the first steps for people is to remind them, hey, others have gone through this. I sometimes have gone through this, and it can be normal that you're going through this. I find there's two types of experiences that I've seen, and I have a limited knowledge of this because it's not my area of specialty. Is that there's people who go through small stints of feeling in a dark place. So they'll do that. It could be a seasonal thing. It could be a time in their lives that just increases pressure. COVID is definitely one of those seasons, right? But then there's other people who experience a type of dark, consistent type of depression over a long period of time. I mean, it just doesn't change. And in those moments, I think really professional care is needed urgently. And so I think if you know someone that you love that is going through a time, helping them discern and really discerning between, like, is this a seasonal thing, or is this something I've seen consistently in your life? And here's maybe a story if I have time. Do I have time to share a quick story, Allison? Am I good for a little story here?
Yeah, for sure.
I often think of a friend of mine who told me this experience in their lives about their grandfather who struggled with alcoholism. So obviously not a mental health issue, but a serious addiction to being an alcoholic. And he kind of worked through it. But one of the things that happened, he realized that he knew someone who was going through the same thing, and he wasn't sure how to help them right away because they couldn't admit that they were, over drinking and really, really an alcoholic. So he committed to go with them to AA meetings. So he didn't have that problem anymore, but he said, you know what, I'm going to come with you if you go to these meetings, and I'll just come with you regularly. So sometimes for someone who finds himself in a really dark place, who can't see beyond it, they just need someone to just go with them wherever that is, to say, hey, if you see someone at your school that's a counselor, how about I come with you? Or if you visit this church group that might be talking about this issue, I'll go with you, And if nothing comes of that, that's okay. No pressure, but let's just do this together. So sometimes helping them know that there's someone who's going to do this with them kind of helps them to see that there's a bigger picture, there's empathy there, there's hope. That's maybe something that could help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah.
Here's the next question. Many Christians don't believe it is possible to be depressed as a Christian because we should have joy from the Lord. How can we counter this in a loving way?
That's a wonderful question. I think the first thing is to remember that joy in the Lord, it doesn't mean happiness as it's presented in our culture. Our culture definitely is almost addicted to a type of like positivity, never negative energy. I have this funny joke that I often use, if Jesus stayed away from all the negative people in his life, he'd never have disciples. The earliest followers of Jesus were people who were incredibly complex, negative, mad, angry, making mistakes, fumbling along. So one is, I think we need to rediscover what the joy of the Lord means. It's that we really are experiencing a deep sense of joy by being who the Lord says that we are. I think when we understand that, it's that our joy comes from knowing that we are children of God, even when we don't feel as children of God. That we are loved by God, even when we don't feel lovable. That God hears us when we don't have the words to express how we feel. And that in those moments, there's a special kind of joy that we can have. And for some people, if they don't learn that, joy becomes, how come you're not always smiling? How come you're not always happy? And I think Megan did a great job in her video too, by just reminding us that Jesus himself, who at least in the Christian faith is the epicenter of the story, is the great model of joy who weeps over a city. He's the great model of joy who's frustrated over people taking advantage of God for the wrong reasons. He's able to live with this place of joyful attention to his identity, but also allowing other emotions to be part of that. So I think that's a really important question, and it's one that churches, spiritual leaders need to do a better job at correcting a kind of naive or simplistic view of the joy of the Lord. It's much more complicated biblically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, I just have a quick follow-up question to that.
Yeah.
If some people are like wondering more about what is this like joy and this hope that can be constant, what do you think is like a first step towards that and towards understanding it and having it be something that they know personally?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think I remember experiencing that myself in my own life. I went through a deep season of doubt where I didn't believe in God for a little while, and kind of went through a stream of studies thinking like religion is ridiculous. It kind of is almost a crutch to pretend that there's some magical figure in the sky who's going to fix all the problems in the world. And so I think one of the first steps is to just, if you really are sensing that it's time for this courageous step forward, is to maybe explore the story of Jesus and Christianity in a new way. For some of us, the hurdle is like, we think we know what Christianity is about. Like I thought I knew what Christianity was about. And my experience was my version of Christianity was all the bad stuff that people had done, or all the annoying people that called themselves Christians but were weird. And that led me to a long journey of obviously doing my graduate studies in the early church, and my PhD in what's known as Reformation studies. It's a whole nother Zoom call, but really exploring Christianity from a new perspective. And I think as people begin to do that, they might realize something that I realized, that in the story of Christianity, we're given this radical belief that not only are we invited to show compassion to one another. I think that's kind of a universal principle, whether you believe in God or not, be nice to your neighbor, do unto others what you would have them doing to you, right? But the radical idea of Christianity that really distinguishes Christianity from some other religions is that God himself is compassionate, that God comes to suffer alongside us. I mean, that would have been a radical idea in the ancient world, especially to Greek thinkers. I mean, the gods were great at using people. The gods were great at getting their own way, but that there was a God who was going to come and suffer alongside people. That was a radical concept. And I think when I understood that, I thought, I need to maybe revisit this Christianity thing. I don't think I understand it. And so that led me on a long journey to explore the story. So maybe for some of you, that's a next step for you.
Yeah, that's so encouraging. Yeah, I love that imagery of God reaching down to us, and it's not us trying to get to him.
Yeah, it's almost like, and I think when you really experience deep seasons of darkness, you know this, if you're listening to this, you actually don't even know how to reach out to God. That's why the prayers of even Lamentations are people saying like, I don't even know where you are. Like, would you just find me where I am? And God's like, almost like through the story of Jesus saying, I got this, I'm coming for you. It's pretty powerful.
It's beautiful. Next question here: How do we destigmatize mental illness without normalizing or accepting the negative behavior that goes with mental illness?
Yeah, that's a great thing, and actually the researcher that I talked about, her name was Ellen Baxter, who does some research on this, really highlights some of this work that when mental illness is really taken seriously and mental health issues are really taken seriously, you distinguish between listening and also keeping people accountable when they act in ways that are irresponsible, even when they're struggling with a mental illness. And so that's a really important step. And I think one of the ways that it happens is by acknowledging that with people. I think of people that I love and people that I know who maybe have a child or a young person in their home who struggles with mental health issues. And the consistent reminder of saying, hey, for example, you can't throw, that computer on the floor when you're upset. That is unacceptable, but I understand that you're mad right now. So there's like there's almost like a teaching in love that happens along the way. I'll often say to people, listen, I know you're upset, but it's unacceptable to hang up on this phone call when we talk. Okay. So next time we talk, can we just commit together that you won't hang up and I'll still be here? So there's like an acknowledgement of that without overreacting or getting angry. And I know the feeling that I've had people hang up on me because they didn't like what I said, and then they'll come back and say, I'm really sorry, I shouldn't have hung up, but I'm like, listen, remember we talked about that being unacceptable behavior, but I understand that you're angry. So kind of coaching and teaching along the way, but it takes a lot of work.
Yeah. That's good advice. Thank you. What practical actions can churches take to create more inclusive environments for people struggling with mental health issues?
Yeah. One of the things is just realizing that some churches have a certain theological lens by which they view some challenges in the world. And I think is helping churches really need to broaden that lens sometimes to realize, hey, maybe we've learned about this topic in this way, but we need to revisit this topic from a new perspective. One of the things we've done in our context, and it's not like, the only thing to do, is we hosted a mental health conference, brought in a special speaker. And for some of you who are connected to this, there's some resources that are available. And actually one of her books, her name is Amy Simpson, is as part of the resources that are available maybe on the website. And we brought Amy Simpson in to just talk about the role of the church in mental health issues. And so that's a really great first step. People who are leaders or people in places of spiritual authority also have a responsibility to sometimes just share more openly about their struggles with doubts, their struggles with questions about the Bible, their struggles with not always knowing exactly what God's saying. I think some people have been taught they have to almost pretend like, I hear God's voice and God said this, and you hear that kind of overconfidence that can come across as very very difficult for people to be like, really? Like, you just always hear God? That sounds a bit creepy to me. So a bit of that balance of just saying, yeah, I do sense God speaking sometimes, but it's not like that's happening all the time, right? So just some of that. There's some great resources right now too about saying, what does the Bible say about suffering? What does the Bible say about people who came to Jesus and struggled with, concerns? So I think churches need to gently start to push that open. And if you're listening to this and you're a leader in a church and you have some influence, can I just encourage you to maybe from this talk, either encourage your church to watch this together or read a book together, or even here's this really, really important, and I'll speak as a spiritual leader in a church setting now, just for a minute, is that it can be overwhelming to get the whole church to be on board, right? But you can say, hey, Pastor so-and-so, hey, my local priest, my rabbi, or whoever, you're connected to in the local, in your local context, just ask them for permission to start like a small book study, just for a few people. And that sometimes can be a first step to getting a bigger conversation going, rather than being a little bit more like, our church needs to be addressing this forever. You're like, whoa, it's a bit intense. That kind of approach. Maybe that helps, Allison.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's a great idea. Another question here. Are there examples of individuals with mental illness in the Bible? If so, how did people react in that passage?
Yeah, the Bible, if you're unfamiliar with the Bible, does not in any place use the word mental illness or mental health. That's a very much a modern way that we express some of these new findings that we're exploring. Obviously have to do with neuroscience, our ability to study the brain, our ability to study chemicals in a new way. But having said that, I think that many of the people who are presented to us in Scripture go through incredible seasons of painful questioning. One of the most famous stories in the Bible is of a person who writes many of the books in the New Testament. His name is Paul. And his experience is this incredible anger and turmoil related to his life kind of changing direction. If you've ever experienced changing direction in your life and doing something completely different, you realize it's almost like a whiplash effect. And not only does he experience this aha moment, realizing, wow, I got to rethink some of the spiritual questions that I have about God. He goes through a seasons where he experiences incredible pain and suffering. He finds himself in prison. He then talks about experiencing this, the language he uses in the Bible is this thorn in the flesh. And scholars are conflicted exactly about what that means, but maybe he struggles with blindness. He can't see well. And yet along the way, he's still used by God in a powerful way to help others. So I think to learn about mental health from a kind of a biblical perspective requires like a larger lens rather than just one story of one person. It takes just a little bit more discipline, but just a local church that's kind of teaching the Bible and helping people along can guide you along that way. If we had time, I probably would say a little bit more about how people in the Bible times understood sickness and health. They obviously had a very different category than we often have today. So it requires a little bit more explaining, but maybe for another time.
Yeah, no, that's still a really interesting answer, though. Really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Here's another question. I heard someone say, God is not responsible for suffering, but he sends Christ to end it. But what does that actually mean?
Yeah. I'm not sure like I fully agree with that idea. There is a sense that in the Christian tradition, I'll speak just from that position because it's the perspective I have most. In the Christian tradition, there's a very clear sense that God really presents himself to us and reveals himself to us as a God who's not only loving, but that he's good. And that his goodness is not only that he does good things, but that it overflows out of who he is. Right? So one of the things that we wrestle with, we're conflicted by how can you have a good God and then see suffering in the world, right? And I think our perspective is a world that is good should not have suffering. I think that's why my talk on talking about pain is so important, that maybe experiencing pain and experiencing seasons of certain types of suffering can make us aware of something that, is important to being human. Actually, to be human is to experience that. Now, in the Christian faith, this is a 1,000-year debate about what we do with evil, what we do with suffering. I think there's some of the other panelists are also talking about that topic a little bit. But I would say that at the heart of the suffering that we see in the world, it has to do with us really living lives that go against some of the parameters that God has provided for us. Maybe this is kind of a funny and silly example. Just thinking about seeing a fish who tries to walk out of the water, step out of the water. Like if a fish says, I need to be set free and I need to be able to walk like ducks can walk. The fish can try to do that, But within a little while, there's going to be incredible pain for that fish because a fish is not meant to walk out of water, right? And so I think that the Bible presents us with parameters for how God created us to live in his goodness and his joy. And when we start to push against those parameters and want to do other things, suffering, and the Bible uses the word sin to describe this, a type of disobedience is activated. It activates a type of world where we see brokenness and sin and suffering around us. And so the age-long question is like, what do we do about that? And I think the point of that quote, I think Jesus really is the example of what God does with our suffering, is how he enters our suffering and doesn't just fixes us. He doesn't just come to fix us, but the actual word is he comes to reconcile and restore something in us, which is such a different concept that I think the word fixing misses. So maybe that helps.
Yeah, it's so much more personal.
Yeah, healing, it's personal, it's presence, where fixing feels mechanical. Like it's like, I fixed you, moving along. God never does that.
Yeah, stays with you through.
Yeah, he's very present. Yeah, very present. And in a sense, teaches us to be present with others too.
Yeah, very true.
Yeah.
Here's another one. You said you were addicted to music. What does that mean? How do you use different art forms to heal?
Yeah, I studied music at Vanier College. Any Vanier people listening in, like, what's up, Vanier students? Music department. I studied drums, and I remember in those dark times of real anger, I kind of immersed myself in playing drums and playing music almost in an isolation way, to the point that I got tendonitis. I hurt myself. I was playing too much. I was practicing too much. It was a great thing because I could always blame it on I was just doing more schoolwork. But the truth is I couldn't really figure out that it was my mechanism to not have to either deal with my parents or my family or others. So in that way, my art or the gift of art actually was backfiring and I was using it in a bad way. Where for other people that I know, like art sometimes is a gift where they can write music, or there's certain types of music that can be really, really healing. I mean, it's the power of really great music to hear words of other people who are talking about pain and suffering. And so music is one of the arts that helps us, you know. There's a lot of new research on whether it's painting, whether it's certain types of exercise, you know, that can both be helpful, but in my case can also be used as a mechanism to continue to not be honest with oneself. So
yeah, it's a good reminder. Mental health seems to have a genetic aspect to it. What do you do when you feel like you are doomed to be depressed because your parents suffered from it too?
Yeah, that is a really, really that I think is one of the darkest and most difficult aspects of talking about mental health. When there's a systemic maybe challenge that you sense is there, is I would still want to give whoever asked that question a sense of hope. You know, that you can acknowledge that maybe there is a type of depression that's following you or in your family or in, you know, a genetic disposition towards that. But by talking about it and even getting some help, sometimes it's just some medical help, you know, becoming aware of that maybe helps us deal with it in a way different than maybe how our parents or our grandparents might have dealt with that. It might never go away completely. It might always be there, but it doesn't have to have the type of crippling effect or the type of really trapped effect that it maybe had with others in your family. And so just to know that you're not doomed, you know, you're not alone, and that there is incredible research going on that's really going to continue to help us to explore this in a new way. And so just know that there's some joy in all of this as we continue to learn about this.
So encouraging. Thanks. Yeah. Let's see. Just waiting on another question here. Oh, perfect. Okay. The Bible has such a history of lament and being true to our emotions. Why and when did the church start getting awkward about this historically?
What a great question. Yeah. I mean, it's happened in different ways. I mean, the church kind of goes through kind of pendulum swings, especially if you think about your own experience with church or religious life. You know, there's some communities of faith that are highly, highly experiential and emotional. And I think for some people, a reaction to that was to almost minimize emotion altogether. And then learning about God becomes very scholastic. That's where you get kind of the tradition of, well, we just teach the Bible. You know, it's kind of almost without realizing that the church creates both like this or that. It's almost like a black and white approach. You're either very academic and you learn the Bible and you memorize verses, or you're into like an emotional frenzy. And there's all kinds of language historically for this, like revival language. And maybe this is my PhD research coming out. So just if I can, just so you might need a reminder, this was a real aha moment for me, that some of the most exciting renewal moments in the life of the church where people were experiencing a real emotional sense of God's presence. So a real honest connection with their emotions, whether it was joy, whether it was repentance or sadness, also birthed new schools of theological learning, which is not something we usually connect together. We usually connect like a revival or people being overly experiential with being less educated, with being like, oh, they're just like people with their emotions, they don't read. And actually the church gives us models where people have learned to do both at the same time. And so when that hasn't happened well, I think to the person's question, churches pick one or the other. So I'm really excited about the next generation. Many of you who are listening to this call who will begin to model something more balanced. There is a way to be connected to learning about our emotional lives. Our experiences can really, God comes to us in our experiential life, right? But also there's a robust theological lens that we can develop as well that teaches us to think carefully about our faith.
That's great. And just a really quick follow-up question to that. You mentioned just presence of God. Can you just briefly explain like what that can look like or mean?
Yeah. I mean, the presence of God is really, really big language. It's a big bucket, right? That can mean a lot of things for different people. One of the things is, it can mean just a sense of knowing that your life has meaning and purpose in a bigger way. That's kind of a very simple way. This is most activated in people's hearts when they are helping other people, because it's something that's invisible that becomes very visible. If you help someone who's maybe in a difficult situation and they say like, it really helped me, you realize, hey, like I have certain gifts, and when those gifts are being used, they help others. So there you sense God's presence helping you make a difference in someone's life. For other people, presence is connected to prayer. So you can experience God's presence when you're in silence doing nothing. That it requires a bit more maturity for people, because we equate silence with being bored or being lazy. So in the Christian tradition, it's taken a bit more work to connect silence with God's presence, especially if you're raised in a more activist view of religion, like religion is doing things or trying to act, right? Not to be confused with trying to earn God's love, but there is a participation factor that we're called into. Jesus did say that one of the ways that we love God is we love our neighbors, right? So he connects those two things together. So I would say there's different ways that we experience God's presence in our lives. So prayer, but also participating in using our resources to help others.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. That's really helpful. We have about a couple minutes left, so probably enough time for one or two more.
Okay.
How might the increase in social media and our digital world be impacting the increase in people struggling with mental health? It's a big one.
Yeah, that's a real big one. And, I know that organizations that I've read about are doing lots of research on this. I mean, even platforms like Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter are already releasing some important studies that are revealing our inability to disconnect from what we see on a screen that might seem always happy, always joyful, the fear of missing out, realities, to how people experience their own lives in the real world. So one of the things that's going to be really important for all of us, especially those of us who've kind of almost been raised in a social media world, I'm not that young, but I do remember a little bit of just the transition to the internet and always having social media around. But for a younger generation, many of you who are listening to this, who are always on your phone or always are on a device, it really is going to be important to develop the discipline of disconnecting from some of those devices. Especially if you notice tendencies that going on Instagram too often or going on a platform too often is causing a type of I'll just use the language of unrest, an inner unrest, and so sometimes just disconnecting for a little while is not a bad thing. we're almost like developing new muscles, for how to live in a digital world. And many of us are just the first generation learning how to do that. So I think our kids and our grandchildren and years from now, there'll be a bit more developed thinking for this. But it's almost like, think about the first time cars were invented and we didn't have speed limits, right? Be like, hey, we need some speed limits. People are going to kill themselves. And then someone's like, hey, we need seatbelts. We need seatbelts. That's going to be important, right? So it's kind of a learning that will emerge as we move forward.
Yeah, it's in the growing stages for sure.
Yeah, we're super in the growing stages. Yeah.
So we have about 4 minutes left. So let's see if we can get through 2 more. We'll see how this one goes here. How can we help someone who thinks? How can we help someone who thinks only prayers can help, but they clearly need clinical help?
Yeah. That's big. So obviously, from that question, I think it definitely is that some people have never developed a thoughtful, robust view of prayer. Prayer can easily become a crutch or a type of a cop-out mechanism for many people, like I'll pray and then I'll just wait and do nothing type of thing. That's obviously not what prayer is meant to be, at least in the Christian tradition. So I'm not sure if in other traditions as well, just to be generous to other religions, I'm sure prayer is much more robust in other religious traditions. So I think it's just remembering, that the people who prayed the most in the Bible were also acting. Paul prayed, but he wrote letters to churches. Jesus prayed, but he also died on a cross. I mean, prayer is meant to also activate a certain response. And people who are reading their Bible and learning should be able to see that. Oftentimes people who think prayer is kind of a one fix wonder actually view prayer as magic. Prayer is a magical formula, and the Bible says lots about warnings about magic and about certain types of almost, religious. The biblical language is very, very robust around this, around biblical sorcery, or thinking that you can pray and make God do something for you, and not do anything. There's a lot of warnings about that in the Bible. So if it's someone who's just learning how to pray, I'd say be very sensitive, because sometimes when people start to learn how to pray, it is kind of a introduction to prayer. Like, I'll pray and I'll wait and hope God fixes this, But level 2 of prayer is I prayed and I heard God say to me, I should talk to someone. That part of it. So I'll often ask people, as you're praying, what do you sense maybe God is asking you to do? So that teaches people to hold both their praying and their action together.
Yeah, part of that relationship thing is that we pray, but then we also listen.
Yeah, and we respond, and for some people too, they'll pray and, because they don't know what to do right away, they're like, I don't have to do anything. I didn't hear anything. So that's okay. But after a while, if that's the only response for a long period of time, it gets a bit more complicated.
Got to respond. Yeah, for sure.
You just respond. Yeah.
That's really helpful. Okay, yes, I think there's time for one more. We have 2 minutes. Let us see if there.
Allison, you are on fire. Where do we do the likes? You're just navigating this so well. Great job. Great job.
Thank you so much.
Navigating
well, you're too. Thank you. Well, you're giving such amazing advice. It's super encouraging and helpful. So thank you so much. All right, here's the last one. Rapid fire round here.
Here we go.
How do we dispel the lies like I am a failure, useless, no one cares about me, when depression occurs for our loved ones and for ourselves?
Yeah, I think these are important things. Like I said, where we're reminded, at least in the Christian faith, that we're loved in the midst of our struggles, right? That we have, a view of our place in the world where failure is okay. Okay, like that's it. Like, there's a big difference between the idea that I failed versus I am a failure. They're not the same things. And I think it's such an important lesson. And no matter where you're listening from, no matter what you're studying, if you're going to be a leader, in anything in your life, you kind of have to learn very quickly, hey, I tried this and I failed. I'm learning from this. And I think I need some help getting better at this task, but I'm not a failure. I'm going to get better at this. So I think for some people, when they don't make that distinction, there is a sense that stumbling along, or I picked the wrong program, or I failed on my math exam, makes it feel like, oh, my life's going to be useless. And that's just not true. Just continuing walking along and slowly learning along the way. I'm a dad with 3 boys, and I often see this even in their lives where they'll make mistakes. and they'll be like, oh, I hate this, I'm not good at school, and I often tell my kids, I'm still in school. I'm reading, gone on to do my PhD, so just instilling the value of failing and learning, even at an early age for yourself, is going to be a great skill you're going to need in the future.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to fail. You're not a failure.
Wow, that is so encouraging. Thank you so much for encouraging us that we don't have to walk alone, that we have help and we have hope in Jesus, and also just going to people to talk to them, and and this new perspective on pain that you gave us, just everything. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks, Allison. It's such an honor to be with you also. Thank you so much.
Amazing. All right, before we conclude our talk today, I'd like to briefly talk about something called Alpha, which I mentioned a little bit earlier on. It's an interactive series which engages people in conversations about the Christian faith. It is a series of sessions focused on questions of life, faith, and meaning. Each session includes time to connect, watch a talk, and share any thoughts or questions that you have. We are meeting online starting the week of January 25th, and we'd love to see you there. If you are interested or would like to receive more information about it, if you haven't filled out that follow-up form yet, you can feel free to do that now. Here's a little video. Thank you. Okay, so there are 2 talks left of this relevant series. We have Suffering and God, a Mental Health Perspective, which is happening tonight at 7. And Where Do We Find Meaning in Life? A conversation between a Christian and an atheist, happening tomorrow night at 7. So those are 2 talks that are left. And like I said a little earlier, I know that some of you may still have questions you want to ask. So after this webinar, we're going to be having a post-talk Zoom from 1:15 to 2. And it will be non-webinar style and more informal. So you can have a chance to talk to the speaker or ask questions in the chat. We will also go over some Slido questions that we weren't able to cover in our time just now. And the Zoom link is down in the chat. From 12 to 1 tomorrow, we will be having Ask Me Anything Zoom sessions. If you have a pressing question about your faith, or maybe many, that you've logged into the back of your mind, come and ask George, a staff member at Power to Change and Westminster Chapel, who will attempt to answer your questions. If you want to try to stump George or just want to listen to other people's questions, then you're invited to. From 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. from 5 to 6 p.m. every evening, we will also have perspective Zoom sessions. In these sessions, you can talk to volunteers and other attendees about 5 important topics: the nature of God, human nature, meaning of life, identity of Jesus, and the source of spiritual truth. We would love to hear your thoughts, your opinions, questions about these topics, and always feel free to invite a friend. And if you'd like to take a screenshot of this slide now to remember the links and the times, feel free to do that. And also you can check out our website for more information. There's some resources there as well from the different talks if you want to read up more about the issues that we've discussed and the topics. And also follow us on social media for more info as well. And those are all on this slide. That brings us to the end of our event today. And a huge thank you once again to Dr. Russo. And thank you also to our AV and coordinator team for making everything run so smoothly. Thank you so much for joining, everyone, and I wish you all the best in this semester.